The biting winds of Christmas week had settled over London, lending a raw, unyielding edge to the festive decorations that fluttered bravely from lamp-posts and shop fronts. A heavy, lowering sky pressed down upon the city, and a thin, crystalline frost clung tenaciously to the bare branches of the trees in Baker Street, sparkling under the gas lamps like a million shattered diamonds. Within the snug confines of our sitting room, however, a roaring fire wrestled valiantly with the encroaching chill, casting dancing shadows upon the familiar clutter of Holmes's various scientific instruments and the towering stacks of monographs that habitually adorned every surface. I, Dr. John Watson, found myself brooding over a rather dry monograph on the advancements in surgical antiseptics, yet my attention was perpetually drawn to the figure opposite me, whose very presence seemed to hold the raw cold at bay. Sherlock Holmes, draped in his familiar dressing gown, sat like a sphinx, his long, lean figure silhouetted against the firelight. A sheaf of newspaper cuttings lay scattered about him, though his keen eyes, fixed upon the eddying patterns of smoke rising from his ubiquitous pipe, suggested his thoughts ranged far beyond the mundane reports of parliamentary wrangling and foreign skirmishes. A faint, acrid odour, emanating from a small retort bubbling gently over the coals, testified to some recondite chemical experiment, a pursuit as stimulating to his intellect as any intricate problem of crime. "Watson," he observed, without so much as glancing my way, his voice a low, resonant murmur that contrasted sharply with the mournful creak of the floorboards. "Your very posture, my dear fellow, speaks volumes. You anticipate with a certain wistful resignation a period of professional stagnation. The festive season, you believe, has temporarily lulled the criminal element into a state of slumber, leaving the instruments of deduction to rust in their scabbards." I confess a slight start ran through me. "You are quite right, Holmes. This lingering Christmas, it seems, promises little in the way of intellectual stimulation. One might almost wish for a diversion, however grim, to stir the stagnant waters of routine. The very air seems to have settled into a somnolent calm." He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of his being. "Be careful what you wish for, Watson. For the very moment one pronounces the world bereft of interesting phenomena, fate, with its peculiar sense of dramatic irony, is apt to present one with a tableau of the most singular and perplexing nature. Indeed, the human heart, my dear fellow, is never truly dormant, not even during the season of supposed goodwill. Its currents of malice, avarice, and desperation flow ceaselessly, awaiting only the opportune moment to surface. And sometimes the very elements of nature, however benign in appearance, can be pressed into the service of the most heinous of human designs." As if on cue, a furious pounding erupted upon our street door, startling Mrs. Hudson, whose hurried footsteps soon announced an unexpected visitor. A moment later, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his usually rubicund face now pale and drawn, his customary bowler hat clutched in a visibly trembling hand, burst into the room. His heavy winter coat was beaded with the icy sleet, and his breath plumed visibly in the warmth of our fire. "Holmes! Watson! Thank heavens you are at home!" he gasped, clearly distraught. "A dreadful business, unspeakable, on Christmas morning itself. I need your assistance, Holmes. immediately. The whole force is at a loss, and the public will be clamouring. It's murder, Holmes, and of the most impossible, perplexing kind." Holmes, his languid air instantly replaced by an electric keenness, rose from his chair, his eyes now blazing with a peculiar light. "Pray, compose yourself, Inspector." Such breathless pronouncements, while undoubtedly testifying to the urgency of the matter, do little to illuminate its particulars. Be seated and relate with the utmost precision the events that have so clearly shattered your customary composure. Lestrade, still visibly agitated, sank into the proffered armchair, running a hand through his sparse hair. "It's Arthur Crutchley, Holmes, the miserly banker, from his estate near Highgate, a man by all accounts as cold and unforgiving as this very blizzard. He was found dead this morning in his study by his housekeeper. Stabbed in the back, Holmes, and the house, sir, is entirely cut off by a heavy blizzard, snowdrifts piled high as a man's chest. No one could have got in or out." I felt a cold prickle of apprehension. Arthur Crutchley. The name was indeed familiar, synonymous with immense wealth, an equally immense parsimony, and a particularly ruthless business acumen. To die so suddenly, so violently, and in such an isolated, sealed environment on Christmas morning. It was indeed a case for Holmes, one that promised to delve into the very depths of human malice and the deceptive qualities of apparent impossibility. "Stabbed in the back, you say, Inspector?" Holmes murmured, his gaze now fixed intently upon Lestrade, taking in every nuance of his distress. "And the means of entry for this assailant, in a house isolated by a heavy blizzard? Or was it, perchance, a suicide disguised to resemble a murder, perhaps to incriminate a rival or to defraud an insurance company? And the weapon, Lestrade? Was it recovered?" Lestrade merely grunted, rubbing his temples. "That's the devil of it, Holmes. The study has French windows leading to the garden, and the snow outside, stretching for 50 yards, is absolutely pristine, not a single footprint. The door to the study was locked from the inside, bolted and barred, just as Crutchley always kept it. And the key, Holmes, the key was in Crutchley's own pocket. No weapon found anywhere in the room. Dr. Billings, the local physician, says it's an impossible murder, or a very, very cunning suicide designed to look like one. But who in blazes would stab himself in the back?" The words hung in the air, creating a macabre counterpoint to the quiet solitude of our room. A miserly banker, stabbed in the back in a locked room with pristine snow outside, and the key in his own pocket. This was indeed a case for Holmes, one that promised to delve into the very depths of theatrical illusion and human malice. Pristine snow, a locked room, the key in the victim's pocket, and a stab wound in the back, Holmes repeated, his voice dangerously soft. A confluence of impossibilities, Inspector. But when the improbable aligns with the impossible, the true solution often lies in dissecting the very fabric of those improbabilities. The lack of footprints, the secured room, the peculiar nature of the injury, all are threads in a tapestry woven with deliberate deception. "Watson, fetch my outdoor things." It appears that the sacred precincts of Arthur Crutchley's study on this most solemn of mornings have been defiled by a most diabolical act. The silent night, my dear fellow, has taken a decidedly grim turn. The cab ride to Crutchley's isolated estate, nestled on the snowbound hills near Highgate, was an arduous journey through a London hushed by the sheer weight of the blizzard. The grand thoroughfares, usually bustling with traffic, now lay largely deserted, their surfaces glistening with ice, their edges piled high with daunting snowdrifts. Our horse struggled, its breath pluming visibly in the frigid air, as it pulled the cab slowly through the treacherous landscape. The majestic facades of the surrounding houses, usually beacons of light and glamour, now appeared rather sombre, their gas lamps battling valiantly against the encroaching darkness of the perpetual grey sky. The very air felt heavy, pregnant with a sense of isolation and foreboding. Crutchley's estate, when it finally loomed into view, was an imposing affair of grey stone, its stark architecture mirroring the character of its late owner. It stood on a slight rise, its formidable outlines blurred by the swirling snow, like a grim sentinel against the desolate landscape. The drive, usually neatly gravelled, was now obliterated by deep drifts, forcing our cab to stop some distance from the house. We proceeded on foot, the crunch of our boots on the pristine snow the only sound, save for the mournful howl of the wind. The silence was profound, almost deafening, reinforcing the sense of absolute isolation. We were admitted by a nervous-looking butler, Mr. Davies, his face pale with shock, and ushered directly into the main hallway. The atmosphere was a palpable blend of chaos and hushed grief, the few remaining staff moving with a quiet, almost reverent efficiency. The pervasive cold of the blizzard had seeped into the very bones of the house, battling valiantly with the sporadic warmth emanating from a few strategically lit fires. The scene of the tragedy, the study, was a room of austere proportions and meticulous neatness, a reflection of Crutchley's precise and parsimonious nature. Heavy, leather-bound books lined the walls, and a massive mahogany desk dominated the centre of the room, upon which lay neatly stacked papers and a ledger. A grand fireplace, however, stood cold and empty in the grate, its ashes undisturbed. At one end of the room, a pair of tall French windows, their panes now obscured by a thick coating of frost, led out onto a small stone terrace overlooking the snow-covered garden. The doors, Lestrade confirmed, had been forced open by the police, its sturdy bolts and internal chain lock having been engaged from within. Arthur Crutchley lay sprawled upon the polished parquet floor, a grotesque figure in his dark dressing gown, a crimson stain blossoming across his back. His face, usually set in a grim, avaricious mask, was now frozen in a rictus of terror and profound surprise. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared upwards at the ornate ceiling, fixed in a final, chilling expression of mortal agony. There were no other visible wounds, no signs of struggle, save for the violence upon his back. Dr. Billings, the local physician, a thin man with spectacles perched on his nose, was already present, packing away his instruments. He merely grunted when he saw us. "Heart attack, Holmes. Clear as day. Exacerbated by a weak constitution and, I dare say, a night of sheer terror. The old man had a history of angina, you know. Poor diet, no exercise. A perfectly natural death, if a rather dramatic one." Holmes merely offered a terse nod, his eyes already sweeping the room, taking in every detail with an almost predatory intensity. He ignored Dr. Billing's pronouncements for a moment, his gaze fixed on the grim tableau before him. He first directed his attention to the body, carefully examining the stab wound in the back. "Observe, Watson," he murmured without looking up, his voice barely audible above the mournful howl of the wind outside. "The nature of the injury. A clean, deep puncture wound delivered with precision and force. The trajectory indicates a downward thrust, suggesting the assailant was either taller than the victim or struck from an elevated position. There is surprisingly little blood, consistent with a rapid penetration of a vital organ, but the edges of the wound, they are unusually clean, almost unnaturally so. It lacks the raggedness one might expect from a conventional blade." He then straightened up, his gaze sweeping the room, coming to rest upon the grand fireplace. Within its cold grate, a few spent logs lay, unburned. But on the hearth, just before the iron grate, a small, dark puddle of water stood, already beginning to freeze at its edges. "Aha, Watson," he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper, a flicker of profound satisfaction in his keen eyes. "And here, my dear fellow, is our first true whisper from the impossible. Observe, Inspector, this puddle. The fireplace, as you see, is cold, the logs untouched. There is no source of water from above, no leak in the chimney. And yet this puddle stands. It suggests, Lestrade, the presence of an object that has melted recently. An object, I dare say, that was the very instrument of murder." Lestrade stared, his face a mask of bewilderment. "Melted, Holmes? What in blazes could have melted and caused a stab wound in the back?" "Precisely, Inspector, and now let us consider the other external factors. The French windows, Lestrade. They lead out onto the garden terrace, and the snow beyond, you assert, is pristine, utterly unbroken." Holmes moved towards the French windows, his magnifying glass now his constant companion. He peered through the frosted glass, then opened one of the windows, a mere crack, just enough to look downwards. He did not step out onto the terrace. He scrutinized the untouched snow below. His gaze then extended upwards towards the eaves of the house, directly above the terrace. "Remarkable," Holmes observed, his voice tinged with a peculiar inflection. "Most remarkable. The snow below is indeed pristine, Inspector, for some 50 yards. No footprints, no disturbance. But observe, Lestrade, the eaves directly above this terrace. I perceive a distinct gap, a space where a particularly heavy icicle once hung. A formidable piece of frozen water, I dare say, easily 4 feet long and of a diameter capable of inflicting precisely the wound we observe. That icicle, Inspector, is missing." Lestrade gasped. "A missing icicle, Holmes? Are you suggesting the killer used an icicle? But how? And how did they get it without leaving footprints?" "An excellent question, Inspector, and one that I believe contains the very kernel of our solution. The missing icicle, Lestrade, was indeed the murder weapon. It fell from the eaves or was deliberately dislodged into this room, and the lack of footprints below suggests it was retrieved by no conventional means from the ground." Holmes then insisted upon inspecting the roof itself. Despite Lestrade's protests about the blizzard, Holmes, with an almost maniacal determination, organized a ladder and, accompanied by myself and a reluctant constable, ascended to the frozen heights of Crutchley's roof. The wind howled, whipping at our clothes, and the icy cold seemed to bite through every layer of fabric. The view from the roof was a vast, swirling expanse of white, utterly desolate. Holmes, ignoring the discomfort, moved with surprising agility across the snow-dusted tiles, his keen eyes sweeping the terrain. He approached the large brick chimney pot directly above the study. There, almost invisible against the blackened brick, caught on a rough edge of the terracotta, was a thin, almost ethereal strand. He carefully extracted it with tweezers. "Aha, Watson," he breathed, his voice barely audible above the wind, a flicker of profound satisfaction in his keen eyes. "And here, my dear fellow, is our final, undeniable truth. Observe, Inspector, this fine, strong strand. It is a length of fishing line, thin yet remarkably robust, and snagged here on the very chimney pot above the victim's study. It suggests, Lestrade, that someone was on this roof, or at least used this high vantage point, to manipulate an object, I dare say, intimately connected to the missing icicle and to the death of Mr. Arthur Crutchley. Our descent from the roof was a hazardous affair, but Holmes's grim satisfaction outweighed any physical discomfort. Back in the comparative warmth of the study, Lestrade, though thoroughly bewildered, was beginning to grasp the chilling implications. "So, Holmes," he began, rubbing his temples, "the icicle was the weapon. It somehow got into the locked room, stabbed Crutchley, and then melted, leaving no trace. And the fishing line, it was used to get the icicle, or to guide it from the roof. But the locked room, Holmes, and the key in his pocket. How could an outside killer accomplish this?" Holmes settled into an armchair, his eyes half closed, a plume of smoke curling from his pipe. "Indeed, Inspector, the locked room, the key in the victim's pocket, the stab wound in the back, all point, at first glance, to a suicide. A perfectly staged suicide, designed to incriminate another. Consider Crutchley's character, his famed avarice, his cunning. He may have wished to cast suspicion upon a rival, perhaps a Mr. Jeremy Thorne, with whom he has been embroiled in bitter disputes, as your initial inquiries have doubtless revealed. The plan would be thus. Crutchley, anticipating death, knowing his heart was failing, decides upon a final, malevolent act. He obtains a heavy icicle, perhaps from the eaves by means of a long pole extended through a ventilator, or even from some hidden cache of ice within his miserly larder. He stabs himself in the back, ensuring the wound is fatal. He then locks the study door, places the key in his pocket, and allows the icicle to melt, leaving no weapon, only the seemingly impossible murder. The pristine snow outside the French windows, if he never opened them, would further seal the illusion of an untouched crime scene. I stared at Holmes, a sudden comprehension dawning. A suicide framed as murder, Holmes, and a brilliant one designed to incriminate a business rival. Lestrade, his face a mask of astonishment, began to nod. "By Jove, Holmes, that explains everything. The locked room, the key, the melting weapon, and Crutchley, the old devil, was certainly cunning enough for such a malicious final act." Holmes, however, merely raised an eyebrow, a faint, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips, though his eyes retained a sliver of profound doubt. "A plausible theory, Inspector, indeed, one that accounts for many of the baffling circumstances, but it leaves certain crucial points unsatisfactorily explained. Firstly, why stab oneself in the back? While not impossible, it is an exceedingly awkward and painful method for a man to inflict upon himself. Secondly, the fishing line on the chimney pot. While Crutchley may have used a pole to retrieve an icicle, the snagged fishing line, a strong, finely braided cord, suggests a more deliberate external application. It is too specific a clue, Inspector, to be merely incidental. The suicide Lestrade is too perfect, too theatrical, too contrived. Over the next few hours, while Lestrade, energized by Holmes's initial suicide theory, focused his inquiries upon Mr. Jeremy Thorne, the business rival, Holmes chose to remain at Crutchley's estate. He expressed a desire to examine the house more thoroughly, to absorb its very atmosphere, to find the discordant note in the seemingly perfect harmony of a suicide designed to incriminate. Our discreet interviews with the household staff revealed more about Crutchley's character. He was indeed miserly, precise, and utterly friendless. He had a profound distrust of all mankind, and of Thorne in particular. The blizzard, the staff confirmed, had truly isolated the house. No vehicles or individuals had entered or exited since the previous evening. The staff themselves had been confined to their quarters, their routine disrupted by the severity of the weather. Holmes, however, seemed particularly interested in the moments leading up to Crutchley's death. He probed the butler, Mr. Davies, about Crutchley's last known actions. "Lord Crutchley, sir," Davies recounted, his voice trembling, "was in his study last night as usual, working late, as was his wont. He dismissed me shortly after 10 o'clock, and I locked the main door, as always. He would lock his study door himself, from the inside, a habit he maintained meticulously." Holmes then returned to the study, his gaze now focused with renewed intensity upon the French windows, the cold fireplace, and the very structure of the room. He re-examined the inner mechanism of the French window's latch, finding a subtle, minute scratch, almost invisible, as if the latch had been operated with a degree of haste or force. He then turned his attention to the precise point where the icicle had been missing from the eaves, and the angle it would have taken to fall into the room, relative to Crutchley's body. His eyes then narrowed, scrutinizing the floorboards just inside the French windows. The pristine snow outside had remained undisturbed, the blizzard having ceaselessly replaced any trace of footprints. But on the floorboards, almost imperceptible beneath a fine layer of dust, Holmes detected a thin, almost translucent smear. He carefully scraped a minute sample, placing it into a small file. "Aha, Watson," he murmured, his voice low and intense. "Here is the truly discordant note. This smear, this faint, translucent residue. It is a particular type of waterproofing grease used in certain nautical applications, or indeed in the lubrication of heavy firearms. A rather unusual contaminant for the pristine floor of a banker's study." I stared at the file, then at Holmes. Waterproofing grease? But what? Precisely, Watson. It suggests the presence of a specific individual, one familiar with such substances, and one who might have been, shall we say, in a position to apply a certain persuasive force from outside. Now, let us consider the suicide theory again. Why stab oneself in the back, Watson? when a direct, less painful method, such as a thrust to the chest, would suffice? And why, when faced with an intruder, would one not simply open the door and scream for help, particularly if one had already secured the weapon? Holmes then led me into the main hallway, just outside the study door. He examined the door itself, its heavy oak construction. He noted the precise fit of the door to its frame, the very subtle gap between the bottom of the door and the carpeted floor. He then ran his hand along the wall beside the door, his sensitive fingers probing the cold plaster. His eyes, however, fixed upon a small, almost invisible scuff mark on the wainscoting just below the level of the doorknob, and another faint, circular indentation on the wall opposite the door. "And here, Watson," Holmes stated, his voice ringing with a new certainty, "is the final, crucial piece of our puzzle. This scuff mark, these subtle indentations. They speak of a body pressed hard against the wall, perhaps in a moment of extreme tension or deliberate concealment. And the grease, Watson, the waterproofing grease. It aligns perfectly with the hand, or perhaps the boot, of an individual positioned in this very hallway at a very specific moment." He then looked at me, a grim expression on his face. "Crutchley, Watson, did not commit suicide. He was murdered. And the locked room, the icicle, the pristine snow, all were part of a meticulously planned deception by the true killer. A deception that almost, but not quite, succeeded." The cab, having traversed the damp and fog-shrouded streets, deposited us back on Baker Street. Inspector Lestrade, his usual gruff demeanour now replaced by a profound solemnity, accompanied us, a rather pale and agitated Mr. Jeremy Thorne in tow. Thorne, a man of 50 with sharp, intelligent eyes that betrayed a cold, calculating intellect, and whose hands, though manicured, seemed to possess an unnatural stillness, sat stiffly on our sofa, radiating an aura of barely suppressed apprehension. He had, under intense questioning, finally admitted to being at Crutchley's estate during the blizzard, attempting to force a meeting with the banker regarding a dire business matter, claiming he was denied entry by the staff. Holmes stood before Thorne, his long, lean figure radiating an almost palpable authority. His voice, clear and resonant, filled the small sitting room. "Mr. Thorne," he began, his tone surprisingly devoid of his usual sardonic edge, but steeped in an undeniable authority, "we have, I believe, unravelled the true tragic fate of Mr. Arthur Crutchley. He did not, as the initial impression suggested, commit suicide, nor was he the victim of some phantom assailant. He was murdered, Mr. Thorne, by your own hand. And the method, though ingenious, was ultimately revealed by its own subtle imperfections." Jeremy Thorne's face, which had been pale, now flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson. "Murder! This is outrageous, Mr. Holmes, a baseless accusation. I was not in that study. The door was locked from the inside. The snow was pristine. I tell you, Crutchley killed himself, perhaps to spite me, to ruin my reputation." His voice, though cultured, cracked with a desperate tremor. "On the contrary, Mr. Thorne," Holmes retorted, his voice hardening, "the evidence speaks not of suicide, but of cold-blooded, meticulously planned murder. The puddle of melted ice by the cold fireplace, the missing icicle from the eaves directly above the terrace, and the fishing line snagged upon the chimney pot, all point to the murder weapon. A heavy icicle, obtained from above and delivered into the room. And the peculiar waterproofing grease on the floor, just inside the French windows, a substance often used to lubricate the mechanisms of certain firearms or to protect them from the elements, speaks of your specific presence at that threshold, Mr. Thorne. Thorne swallowed hard, his eyes darting towards Lestrade, then back to Holmes, a flicker of desperation in their depths. "Furthermore, Mr. Thorne," Holmes pressed on, his voice gaining a quiet intensity, "the suicide theory, which you so assiduously hoped to promote, was your own ingenious but ultimately flawed fabrication. You, driven by desperation in your business dealings with the intractable Crutchley, came to the isolated estate in the blizzard, hoping to force a resolution. You gained access to the roof, perhaps by scaling a wall or using a concealed ladder, accounting for the fishing line snagged on the chimney pot. From the roof you obtained the heavy icicle from the eaves. You then descended to the terrace outside the French windows, the ongoing blizzard quickly obscuring any slight footprints you might have made near the window sill. And there, Mr. Thorne, you faced the stubborn Crutchley, who refused to let you in. You, knowing of his miserly habits and his desperate desire to protect his precious study, confronted him through the French windows. You held him at gunpoint through the glass or through a brief, terror-filled opening of the window. You forced him, Mr. Thorne, to open the French windows slightly. Then, using the icicle, you stabbed him in the back, ensuring a fatal wound, knowing the weapon would melt, leaving no trace. The terror on his face, Mr. Thorne, was not of ghosts, but of you. And the final desperate act of Mr. Crutchley was to slam shut the French windows, lock them, and then, in a futile attempt to save himself or to trap his assailant's means of entry, he staggered to the study door, locked it, and placed the key in his pocket, hoping to buy himself precious moments of time before collapsing, dying before he could reopen it. The scuff marks in the hallway outside the door, the circular indentations on the opposite wall, confirm your presence there, Mr. Thorne, as you pressed yourself against the wall, listening to your victim's final dying struggles. Thorne swayed, his face a mask of utter defeat. The meticulous logic of Holmes's deductions had shattered his carefully constructed facade. His breath came in ragged gasps, and he finally collapsed into a chair, his head buried in his hands, his earlier protestations dissolving into choked sobs. "He ruined me!" Thorne choked out, his voice muffled by his hands. "He was destroying my business. He refused every plea. I merely forced his hand. I needed those papers. He deserved what he got. It was an accident. I only meant to scare him." Lestrade, his face a mask of grim satisfaction, stepped forward, his hand resting on his revolver. "Mr. Jeremy Thorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Mr. Arthur Crutchley." It was well past midnight when Holmes and I at last found ourselves back in the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street. The city had finally fallen silent, a profound peace settling over London, now truly quiet, save for the distant chiming of a church clock. The fire in our grate burned brightly, casting a warm, comforting glow upon the room. I poured myself a final glass of claret, the grim details of the case still swirling in my mind. "A truly diabolical scheme, Holmes," I remarked, shaking my head. "To force a man to open his own study to his killer, to use an icicle as a weapon that would then melt away, leaving no trace. And to stage it all in the heart of a blizzard, creating the illusion of an impossible crime. It was ingenious in its cruelty. Holmes, pipe in mouth, merely nodded, watching the wreaths of smoke ascend towards the ceiling. Indeed, Watson, it merely illustrates the truth that the most cunning crimes are often those that employ the most commonplace implements and the most natural human settings, particularly when cloaked in the unexpected. Thorne, the desperate rival, leveraged the opportune blizzard, the cold itself, and Crutchley's miserly and meticulous habits to execute a murder that, to the uncritical eye, seemed utterly inexplicable. He believed the impossibility of the locked room and the melting weapon would ensure his secret remained buried. He paused, then picked up a well-worn volume of forensic entomology from his desk. "But logic, my dear fellow, is a more powerful force than any disguise, and human ingenuity, whether applied to deception or detection, remains a potent and often terrifying force." The Silent Night Murder, as you might title it, was a testament to the fact that even the most elaborate of deceptions can be unravelled by the careful observation of seemingly insignificant details: a cold fireplace, a puddle of water, a missing icicle, a snagged fishing line, and a faint smear of waterproofing grease. And it proves once again, my dear Watson, that the intricate workings of the human heart, with its passions and its betrayals, are far more complex and perilous than any blizzard or locked room. Now, Watson, if you would be so kind as to pass me that volume on the effects of extreme cold on various materials, I believe there are a few lingering points concerning the precise melting rate of icicles under different thermal conditions that I should like to explore before dawn. For even on Christmas Day, the pursuit of knowledge admits of no true rest.